welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The skies over Camelot had not darkened like this for many years. Ominous clouds, thick with magic, swirled in the heavens, casting unnatural shadows over the castle. King Arthur stood at the grand window of the throne room, his face hard, eyes narrowed as he watched the violent storm rage across the kingdom. He had seen many storms in his time, but this was different. The air crackled with a foreboding that gnawed at his instincts as something ancient, something dark, something beyond natural forces. "Your Majesty," came a familiar voice from behind. Merlin, his trusted friend and advisor, entered the room quietly, his long robes flowing behind him as if moved by an unseen wind. His eyes, sharp and filled with knowledge, met Arthur's with a silent understanding. "How bad is it?" Arthur asked, his voice steady but weighted with concern. Merlin hesitated, his staff tapping lightly against the stone floor. "It's not just a storm. It's magic, a dark magic." Arthur clenched his jaw. "Morgana?" "I believe so," Merlin replied gravely. "But there's something else, something deeper. The forces at play here are more ancient than anything I've felt in years. If she's behind this, she's tapped into powers that should never have been touched." Arthur turned to face Merlin fully, his expression resolute. "Then we must stop her." Before Merlin could respond, a knight burst into the room, his armor clanking with urgency. "Your Majesty." Several of the knights stood there missing. Arthur's heart sank. "Who?" "Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, Sir Galahad." A broken bar. They were outside the city when the storm hit. "No one has seen them since." Arthur exchanged a glance with Merlin, the weight of the situation growing heavier by the second. Lancelot, Gawain, and Galahad, three of his finest knights. If Morgana had them, this was no longer just a storm. It was a declaration of war. "We ride at dawn," Arthur declared, his voice carrying the authority of a king but the heart of a man who feared for his friends. "Gather the remaining knights. We're going to find them." The lost forest loomed before them like a vast, living nightmare. Its trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the sky as if to grasp the very clouds themselves. The air was thick with an unnatural mist that clung to their skin, damp and cold, as Arthur led his remaining knights Bedivere, Percival, and a few others into the heart of the forest. "Stay close," Arthur ordered, his hand resting on the hilt of Excalibur. The legendary sword was both a comfort and a reminder of the burden he bore. He had led men into countless battles, but this journey felt different. This was not just a test of strength or strategy, it was a test of the soul. Merlin walked beside him, his staff glowing faintly in the dim light that filtered through the twisted canopy. "This forest," Merlin began, his voice low, "it's not what it seems. Morgana has twisted its nature. It will try to break USA mentally and physically." Arthur nodded, his eyes scanning the forest ahead. "Then we must stay strong, for the knights, and for Camelot." As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around them. The path, if it could even be called that, shifted and changed, as though the trees themselves were conspiring to lead them astray. Every step felt heavier, every breath more difficult, as though the forest was alive and testing their will. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the mist. Arthur's hand shot to Excalibur, drawing the sword with a soft metallic hiss. "Who goes there?" he called out, his voice firm but edged with caution. From the mist emerged a figure, hunched and cloaked in darkness. The knights danced, their hands moving to their own weapons, ready for whatever may come. But as the figure came closer, Arthur realized it was no ordinary foe. It was one of the forest's cursed guardians, a creature of twisted bark and bone, its hollow eyes glowing with malevolent light. With a guttural growl, the creature lunged at them, its claws outstretched. Arthur met its attack with a swift strike of Excalibur, cleaving the creature in two. But as its body fell, more shadows emerged from the mist, the forest coming alive with Morgana's dark creations. "Stand your ground!" Arthur shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos as the knights formed a defensive circle. "We fight as one." The battle was fierce and relentless. The creatures were many, their forms shifting and changing with the forest, but Arthur and his knights fought with a strength born of loyalty and honor. Excalibur gleamed with each strike, its magic burning through the dark enchantments that surrounded them. At Merlin's side, the old wizard summoned his own magic, his staff sending pulses of light through the mist, dissolving the creatures as they came. But even he could feel the toll the forest was taking on them. This was no ordinary battle, it was a war of attrition, one designed to wear them down until they were too weak to continue. "We can't stay here," Merlin shouted over the din of battle. "We must keep moving." Arthur nodded, his breath heavy from exertion. "Fall back." "We regroup ahead." The knights moved as one, retreating from the immediate danger, but the forest did not let them go easily. It seemed to shift and change, guiding them deeper into its heart, as if it had a will of its own. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to play tricks on their minds. Shadows moved where there were none, whispers echoed through the trees, and each night was plagued by visions of their deepest fears and desires. Arthur was no exception. As they made their way through the twisted landscape, he began to see Guinevere. She appeared in the corner of his eye, just out of reach, her soft laughter drifting on the wind. His heart ached at the sight of her, but he knew it was not real. Guinevere was safe in Camelot, far from this cursed place. Yet still, the forest tried to tempt him. It whispered of the life he could have had, of the peace he could know if he would only lay down his sword and leave the fight behind. "Arthur," Merlin's voice broke through the illusion, grounding him. "You must stay focused. This place Morgana's influence it's stronger than we thought." Arthur shook off the vision, his resolve hardening. "I won't let her win." But the forest was relentless. As they pressed on, it became clear that Morgana's magic was not just trying to stop the aim, it was trying to break them. Each step became more difficult, each breath more labored, as though the very air was poisoned with despair. Then, without warning, they came upon a clearing. In the center stood the missing knights Lancelot, Gawain, and Galahad, but they were not the men Arthur had once known. Their eyes were vacant, their faces devoid of emotion, and they stood as if waiting for a command. Arthur's heart twisted at the sight of his friends, his brothers, turned into soulless husks. "Lancelot!" he called out, stepping forward. "Gawain!" "It's me, Arthur." But there was no response. The knights stood still, their weapons drawn but unmoving, like statues carved from flesh and bone. Merlin stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly as he studied the scene. "They're under her spell," he murmured. "Morgana's twisted their minds, made them her slaves." Arthur gripped Excalibur tightly. "Then we'll free them." But before Merlin could respond, a voice echoed through the clearing, a cold, cruel, and all too familiar. "Arthur!" Morgana's voice dripped with venom as she stepped out from the shadows, her dark robes billowing around her like smoke. "How noble of you to come for your precious knights, but I'm afraid you're too late. They belong to me now." Arthur's blood boiled at the sight of her, but he kept his composure. "Let them go, Morgana, this isn't their fight." Morgana laughed, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "Oh, but it is. They're mine now, and they'll serve me just as faithfully as they once served you." Arthur raised Excalibur, the blade gleaming in the dim light. "I won't let you take them." Morgana's smile widened, her eyes glowing with dark magic. "Then you'll have to fight them for their freedom." With a flick of her hand, the enchanted knights sprang to life, their movements stiff but deadly. Arthur barely had time to react as Lancelot lunged at him, his sword slicing through the air with unnatural speed. The clang of steel rang out as Arthur parried Lancelot's attack, the force of the blow sending a shock wave through his arms. Lancelot was a skilled warrior, one of the best Arthur had ever known, but now, under Morgana's spell, his strength was twisted into something dark and unrelenting. "Wake up, Lancelot, Arthur shouted as he blocked another strike. This isn't you. But Lancelot's face remained emotionless, his eyes empty as he continued his assault. Arthur's arm burned from the effort of parrying Lancelot's relentless attacks. Each clash of their swords sent a vibration up through his muscles, threatening to wear him down. But the pain in his heart was far greater. He was fighting his closest friend, the knight who had once stood by his side in countless battles, now reduced to a mindless pawn under Morgana's control. Merlin, meanwhile, was locked in his own struggle. The air around him shimmered with magic as he battled Morgana, their spells clashing and swirling around the clearing in a storm of energy. Morgana's laughter echoed through the air as she hurled bolts of dark magic at him, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. But Merlin was not so easily outmatched. His staff glowed bright as he countered her every move, summoning shields of light to deflect her attacks. Arthur dodged another of Lancelot's blows, his breathing labored. "Lancelot, this isn't you," he shouted, but the words fell on deaf ears. He could see no recognition in Lancelot's eyes, only the cold detachment of Morgana's control. Nearby, Percival and Bedivere were locked in combat with Gawain and Galahad, their faces twisted in concentration as they struggled not only to defend themselves but to avoid injuring their enchanted comrades. The forest itself seemed to pulse with dark energy, feeding off the violence, as if Morgana's magic was rooted deep within the land. Arthur's mind raced. He couldn't keep fighting Lancelot like this. Not only was it physically draining, but the emotional toll of battling his closest friend was threatening to break his focus. He needed to end this, and soon. Then he remembered Merlin's words: Morgana had twisted their minds, enslaved them with magic. The source of her power had to be broken if they were to free the knights. His eyes darted to where Morgana stood, her attention fully focused on Merlin. She was the key. Gathering his strength, Arthur pushed Lancelot back with a powerful swing, forcing a momentary distance between them. Without hesitation, he turned and sprinted toward Morgana, Excalibur gleaming in his hand. He could feel the magic of the sword vibrating through his body, its ancient power responding to his will. Morgana saw him coming and with a flick of her wrist, sent a wave of dark magic hurtling toward him. Arthur barely had time to react. He threw up his shield, the impact nearly knocking him off his feet as the force of the spell slammed into him. But he kept moving, his eyes locked on her, determination burning in his chest. "Morgana!" Arthur roared as he closed the distance between them, his voice carrying over the sounds of battle. "This ends now." Morgana's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Foolish king," she hissed, her hands weaving a complex pattern in the air as she summoned another spell. "You cannot stop me. The power of the old gods flows through me now." But Arthur wasn't listening. With a burst of speed, he raised Excalibur and swung it at her, the blade humming with magic as it cut through the air. Morgana barely had time to react. She raised her hands to defend herself, but Excalibur's magic sliced through her defenses, severing the flow of dark energy that had been holding the knights captive. The moment the connection was broken, Arthur felt Ida shift in the air, a ripple of energy that signaled the release of Morgana's control over the knights. Lancelot, Gawain, and Galahad froze mid-strike, their weapons falling from their hands as the fog lifted from their minds. For a split second, Arthur thought it was over. But Morgana was far from defeated. Her face twisted in rage, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think you've won?" she spat, her voice echoing with dark, unnatural timbre. "You are nothing, Arthur. You and your precious knights will fall, just like Camelot will fall." Before Arthur could respond, Morgana raised both hands, summoning a massive storm of magic that swirled around her, crackling with power. The air vibrated with dark energy, and Arthur could feel the sheer magnitude of the spell she was about to unleash. Merlin, sensing the danger, rushed forward, his staff glowing brightly as he chanted a powerful incantation. "Arthur!" he shouted, his voice straining with effort. "Get back! This magic is too strong, she'll destroy everything." But Arthur stood his ground, his grip on Excalibur tightening. He knew what had to be done. He had no choice but to face Morgana head on. This was the moment that would decide the fate of Camelota, and he could not falter. As Morgana unleashed the full force of her spell, Arthur raised Excalibur high, channeling every ounce of his will into the sword. The blade shone with a light so bright it cut through the dark magic like a beacon of hope. Arthur could feel the magic coursing through him, strengthening him, guiding him. With a mighty swing, Arthur brought Excalibur down, its blade colliding with Morgana's spell in a blinding explosion of light and dark. The impact sent shock waves through the clearing, shaking the very ground beneath them. Arthur gritted his teeth, pushing back against the force of Morgana's magic, refusing to give in. The world around them seemed to freeze for a moment, the battle suspended in time. Arthur could feel the strain in every fiber of his being, but he would not yield. For Camelot, for his knights, for everything he held dear. Then, slowly, the tide began to turn. Excalibur's light grew stronger, pushing back against the dark magic. Morgana's eyes widened in disbelief as her power began to falter, the storm of magic around her dissipating. "No!" she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. "This cannot be. I am the true heir to the old magic." But it was too late. With one final push, Arthur drove Excalibur forward, shattering the last remnants of Morgana's spell. The dark magic imploded, collapsing in on itself and disappearing into the void. Morgana stumbled back, her strength drained, her power broken. For a moment, she looked small, almost human. But the hatred in her eyes remained as she glared at Arthur. "This is not the end," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with venom. "I will return, Arthur, and when I do, Camelot will burn." Before Arthur could respond, Morgana vanished in a swirl of dark smoke, leaving the clearing eerily silent in her wake. Arthur lowered Excalibur, his body trembling with exhaustion. It was over. The knights, now free of Morgana's control, slowly regained their composure, their faces pale but filled with relief. Lancelot approached Arthur, his voice hoarse. "Your Majesty, broken barrier." Arthur held up a hand, silencing him. "There's no need, Lancelot. You were not yourself. None of you were. What matters now is that you are free." Merlin stepped forward, his face lined with weariness but his eyes still sharp. "She's gone for now, but Morgana's power is growing. She will return, and we must be ready." Arthur nodded, his gaze turning to the horizon. The forest around them had already begun to change, the oppressive darkness lifting as Morgana's influence faded. But the weight of her threat lingered in his mind. "We will be," he said softly. "For now, let us return to Camelot. There is much to rebuild." The knights gathered around him, their spirits lifted despite the toll the battle had taken on them. Together, they began the long journey back to Camelot, knowing that the peace they had fought so hard to preserve was only temporary. As they walked, Arthur couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, back toward the forest where Morgana had vanished. Her words echoed in his mind, "Camelot will burn." But he pushed the thought aside. For now, they had won. And as long as he had Excalibur, his knights, and Merlin by his side, he would fight to protect his kingdom from whatever darkness lay ahead.